All right, there's a lot going on here, so I want to break this down into smaller pieces just to get a sense of how this is being created, how this form is being created. And in the process, we'll actually take a look at some of the HTML that's being generated by these helpers. So just the overall structure, I want to show you that we were talking about this. There's this block structure, form for the user, do F, and then inside of here, we've got this F object, and then we're building up the label and text field for each of the attributes. And so this form variable F is essentially an abstraction layer. I don't know how password field, for example, is implemented, but I do know that if I call that method on the form variable, that it will produce this sort of box. So let's take a look at the HTML that underlies this. Take a look at this form. So you can see here we've got label and then an input tag. So this label tag is what's being created by this here. And then the input tag is the HTML tag for this sort of input box, this guy here. And down here you can see it's also an input for password, but then there's a different type, so type equals password. And up here it's type equals text. So that's the difference between this here and this here. You can also see here that the input has a name, which is user of name. So this is in square brackets. This is just a string, but Rails is interpreting this, or Rails will interpret this. When we submit it, Rails will use this name to construct the params hash, essentially, which will let us actually create the user in the database. We'll see that momentarily when we actually submit this form. But for now, there's one more thing I want to show you, which is this weird kind of thing here, this input authenticity token. This is the kind of thing that whenever you see this sort of long string, you can safely ignore this. This is something that's being used internally by Rails. In this case, it's being used to prevent a particular kind of attack called a cross-site request forgery, or a CSRF attack. You can also see there's a line here that has this weird value. It's actually a check mark. And again, this is just used internally by Rails to force the browser to use the right character encoding scheme when we submit the information. So I mentioned it because it does show up here when we inspect it, but this is the sort of thing that you should probably learn to ignore, at least at first, and focus on these sorts of things here that actually correspond to the code that we've been writing. And you can see, by the way, here, this last one, also an input tag, and then it has the name commit. That's something that just comes automatically from the submit tag, this sort of submit helper. And then it's got the type, which is also implicit in the kind of helper, the helper that we read, the submit method. And then the value is what we put in, create my account. So by studying this HTML structure, you can see the effects of these kinds of Rails helpers. So if it ever gets a little bit too abstract, just open up this inspector and take a look at what's being produced by the Rails helpers.